to begin talking about blindness. And here's Dr. Myers to talk about it.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon. Really a great pleasure to be at this conference. I so much appreciate all of you coming out on a sunny Saturday and finding the time to be with us today. It's very, very gratifying to me and my colleagues to have people from the community interested in glaucoma as we are. And I'm also grateful to the efforts of so many of the Wills staff who have come out on their own free time to support this conference today, as well as the sorority sisters. So with that, let me turn to the question of the risk of blindness from glaucoma. I'm going to talk a lot about risk and only a little bit about blindness because I think actually risk is the broader question that there's a lot to consider. Some of you in the audience may be as old as me and be able to remember board games, which are long gone, of course. Now it's all computer games. And the game of Risk was actually a popular board game back in the day. Maybe that was in the 60s and 70s. And so who will dominate the world? Well, when we talk about risk and risk assessment, the question is, how can we understand risk in our lives? Because after all, risk is inherent to everything we do. I drove in today, I took I-95. That's a risky business. But how big a risk is harder to know. After all, when they built the Titanic, it was literally built as an unsinkable ship. And that was the Titanic then. And of course we know this is the Titanic now. And it was a tragedy, but it also underscores how we can fail to see the biggest risks as well as the smallest risks. So when we talk about risk, we talk about insurance. How much would you pay for the tiger insurance in New York City? Guy's walking down the street, is shown there. He sees a guy with aerosol cans full of tiger repellent. He says, there are no tigers in New York, and the person responds to him and says, see how well it works? It's 100% effective. So that's a very low risk. So how much would you pay to minimize your risk of tiger attack? Which comes back, of course, to what we often refer as the Mark Twain quote, which is that there are three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And of course, Mark Twain, in his autobiography, ascribed that to Disraeli, though Twain has left a lasting impact. So we'll talk some about statistics and how we consider risk and what pitfalls as people there are when we think about risk, because most of us are not statisticians. Here's an example. For many things, like lightning strike, actually lightning strike the risk is higher, but we say the odds are 1 in a million. Well, 1 in a million sounds like it ain't never going to happen. But 300 people in America this year will have a 1 in a million event happen to them, right? So for them, that's not so rare. On the other hand, we hear on the news all the time that researchers have uncovered that if you do this, you're 50% more likely to have that. And that is usually something bad. But 50% more likely, 50% of what? So a 50% increase in risk, if it's 1 in a million, I can live with that. But a 50% increase in risk, if it was something that I was likely to get already, well, that could be significant. Now, I'm going to walk through that example in some detail. So which would you pay more for? Which is best? Something that reduces your risk of heart attack by 80%, 50%, or 18%? I think most of us would choose 80%. But I'll give you 3 concrete examples, because when we talk about heart attack, we have really good statistics, because our cardiology colleagues have done studies with hundreds of thousands of people, and they can literally tell us with some degree of accuracy a person's risk of a heart attack or dying in the next 10 years. If we just know their age, sex, if they smoke, and their blood pressure and cholesterol. So here's an example. Here's a 45-year-old smoker with good cholesterol and blood pressure. His risk of dying of a heart attack in the next 10 years, about 5 out of 100. If he stopped smoking, his risk of dying or having a major heart attack goes down by 80%. Goes from 5 out of 100 to 1 out of 100. So we see all these are your 45-year-olds. You have 145-year-old smokers here. 5 of them were going to die or have a heart attack, and they quit smoking, so 4 of them were saved, but 1 guy is still in bad shape. So that's an 80% reduction in risk by quitting smoking. Great. Well, what if you had a 55-year-old, a little bit older smoker, with a bit of high blood pressure and elevated cholesterol? Well, that person has a 30 out of 100 risk of a heart attack in the next 10 years. If he stopped smoking, his risk drops to 15 out of 100. So that's a 50% risk reduction. Here we have the 100 55-year-olds with high blood pressure and smoking. So we had 30 of them who were going to have a heart attack, and he quit smoking. 15 of them were saved, a 50% reduction. Okay, so in the first example it was an 80% reduction, but we only saved 4. In this case, a 50% reduction saved 15. And here we have the 65-year-old, 10 years older again, 65-year-old smoker, not sure what they're doing smoking. Elevated cholesterol, treated, high blood pressure that's under control. So his risk, because his blood pressure is under control, is only 28 out of 100. I say only because the 45-year-old with uncontrolled blood pressure and otherwise similar stats had a 30 out of 100 risk. So he quit smoking. He goes from 28 to 23 out of 100 risk of a heart attack or death in the next 10 years. That's only an 18% reduction in risk, as shown here. Why? Well, when you're 65, your underlying risk of heart attack or death is much higher to start with in the next 10 years. So all 3 of these people quit smoking, but they had very different relative risks to begin with, and so a 50% or an 80% or an 18% reduction in risk. But the 18% reduction in risk actually saved more people than the 80% reduction in risk, because the underlying risk was greater to start. And that's why when the news at night says to me, you have a 50% greater risk of, landing on the moon if you don't eat your cabbage, I think to myself, I really wasn't planning on landing on the moon. And that's why most of what you hear on the news about health and risk is useless, because it assumes something, your underlying risk is usually pretty minimal, and it assumes you know your underlying risk. Let's talk about glaucoma. For most types of glaucoma, if you have glaucoma, and there are lots of you that we do the study on, we can say that if we lower your average eye pressure by 1 point, we reduce your relative risk of getting worse in the next few years by 10%. That means if you reduce someone's eye pressure by 5 points, you reduce their risk of having progressive vision loss by 50%. This is why your doctor spends so much time talking to you about eye pressure, pressure reduction, and treatment with eye drops, lasers, and surgery, because lowering pressure really does reduce your risk. But remember, this is a relative risk reduction. So what is your risk of getting worse? Once again, the tigers. If you don't really have glaucoma, lowering your eye pressure 5 points doesn't really do anything for you after all. Well, if you have ocular hypertension and you're an average person in a study, and few of us are average, most of us are above or below average for anything, your risk over 5 years is about 10% of getting worse. And in one major study called the Ocular Hypertension Treatment Study of 1,600 people in America with ocular hypertension, 10% got worse untreated, but 5% of people got worse after treatment, with an average pressure reduction of about 5 points. So that really makes a difference. Low-tension glaucoma. Well, in one major study of low-tension glaucoma called the Collaborative Normal Tension Glaucoma Study, over 7 years, 35% of patients got worse. So if we could lower each of those patients' pressure by 5 points, that would be only 17% of the patients who got worse. That would be a 17% reduction in the number of patients who got worse. That matters a lot. In one major study of early manifest glaucoma, which was done in Sweden but funded by the National Eye Institute, over a 6-year period, 62% of the people in the study who did not take eye drops or have laser treatment got worse to a small degree. So dropping their pressure by 5 points would lower their risk 31%. So you can see that depending what type of glaucoma you have and how we define whether or not you're getting worse, reducing your pressure 5 points can make a very large difference. SLT. This is a specific treatment, a laser treatment for glaucoma done in the office for people with various types of open-angle glaucoma. SLT typically lowers eye pressure 4 to 7 points. So SLT itself is a fairly safe procedure. That means that a person who undergoes SLT has a less than 1 in 1,000 risk of having a severe vision loss because of the treatment itself. That's relatively safe when we talk about medical procedures. Well, you can see from the prior slide that the degree of risk reduction by lowering pressure completely outweighs the risk of the procedure itself. Okay? So low-risk procedure, high potential benefit, that's an easy choice. What about trabeculectomy? Well, trabeculectomy is a very, very effective surgical treatment to lower eye pressure and prevent glaucoma's progression. However, trabeculectomy carries about a 1% risk of vision loss, which is neither a particularly high nor a particularly low risk when it comes to surgery and treatments for glaucoma. Now, if you have a risk of getting worse from glaucoma, as Dr. Spaeth emphasized that we need to consider our own risk of getting worse to justify treatment, if your risk is 2 out of 100, a procedure that has a 1% risk doesn't sound that great. On the other hand, if your risk was 30 out of 100 of getting worse from glaucoma, a procedure with a 1% risk seems like an entirely reasonable thing to consider. So glaucoma in general, in the adult population in America, has a prevalence of about 1%. That means on average about 1 out of 100 people have glaucoma. If you walk around the inner city of Baltimore and look just at 90-year-olds in Baltimore, the risk is actually closer to 10 to 15%. If you look instead at young adults in college, the risk is closer to 1 in 1,000. So the overall prevalence is about 1%, but your own risk is different depending on who you are. Your risk of blindness from glaucoma, depending on how you look at it, is about 5% overall for all comers. But let's get more specific. If you're someone who is glaucoma diagnosed and you're followed for 20 years, the risk that you get blindness in one eye as a result of the glaucoma in one eye is about 25%. So vision loss from glaucoma is not rare, but how long you have the glaucoma and how severe the glaucoma is really changes what the odds are for you and your eyes. If you want to know more about your own risk for glaucoma, consider these things. If a patient comes to me and says, you know, by the way, both of my parents were blind by the age of 50 from glaucoma, well, that has huge implications. As we all know, we tend to follow in the footsteps of our parents if we don't do anything differently. If a patient comes to me and they already have a walking stick because they've lost a lot of vision and they're only 30 years old, and they say, what are the odds I lose the rest of my sight by the time I'm 99? Well, that's a very different question than a patient who comes to me at the age of 95 and has just the beginnings of glaucoma. Those things are hard to control. However, we all control our treatment. Do we use our eye drops? Do we actually bother to come back and see the eye doctor? If you're in this room now, I'm preaching to the chorus. If you're in this room now, you care about the question of glaucoma, and you're probably doing everything you can. On the other hand, a lot of the people who aren't in this room now, studies show don't use their eye drops religiously, and in many studies, 30% of patients use their drops less than half of the time. In most studies where we go out into the community and survey for glaucoma, for every 100 patients we find who have glaucoma, by the end of the year, only 20% of those patients are still seeing an eye doctor for glaucoma. The rest either never came back to see us or stopped seeing us by the time a year comes. And that means their risk of going blind is much, 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 much higher. And if you're someone who is already noticing that your vision is getting worse and your doctor says it's from glaucoma, unfortunately that does mean that your risk of continuing to get worse is higher than someone whose vision is not currently showing any change in the last 2, 5, or 10 years. However, when we consider risks as humans, not as statisticians, we generally do a bad job. And there are a lot of studies by sociologists that show that spectacular risks scare us more than risks that we take on our own. For example, I like to ride bicycles. Bicycles and cars often get together, but most bicycle riders don't worry about that when they get on a bike. On the other hand, when we hear about an airplane going down, even though airplanes are safer than bicycles and cars, it grabs our attention, and many of us will worry the next time we get in an airplane, even though we won't worry the next time we get in a car. If someone goes through telling us the heart-wrenching story of a young mother of 2 who was in a car accident, that affects us more than if we just hear that 30,000 Americans last year died in car accidents. So things that we do commonly, things that we do by our own choice, things that we think we have control over, like, oh, when I drive, I'm careful not to get into an accident, these we underestimate. Whereas these other things we really worry about, especially things that seem new to us. It's interesting that people value something, losing something, they worry more about that than gaining something. If you take a group of people who just volunteer for a study, and you give half of them beer mugs, and then you say to those people, how much do I have to pay you for you to give me back the beer mug? Let's say they say on average $20. They like that beer mug. And then if you say to the other half the people, without knowing it, I have this beer mug in my hand, how much would you pay for this beer mug? They say, on average, about half as much, $10. Why? Because nobody likes to lose anything, and we worry more about losing things as a society than we do about gaining things. And this has implications when it comes to surgery and glaucoma. So if we take the standpoint that glaucoma is something that most patients know about, have had for a while, and seems natural, that means they tend to undervalue the risk of glaucoma. When a surgeon says to them, you need surgery, which is something new and more concerning, that seems like a higher risk scenario. And that's why as people get comfortable with their risk of vision loss from glaucoma, often they stop taking their eye drops and stop seeing their eye doctor. So to summarize, I'd say risk is something that is spongy. It is not always directly quantifiable. Even when we can quantify it, it's often too complex to use for individual patients. We have biases, our own personal biases and societal biases, that aren't always rational and aren't always obvious to ourselves. However, for most of us, the risk of actually going blind from glaucoma is pretty low. As I said, 5% is the overall prevalence of people who have glaucoma who are blind. And so most people will not go blind for glaucoma, although some people are at risk. And if this is what you do for fun on the weekend, you probably don't have to worry about going blind from glaucoma. Thank you all very much for coming today. Any questions? Not related to the stock market, I trust? Yes.
I have one over there.
Distinction between what you mentioned, trabeculectomy, and the other one,
SLT?
SLT.
The laser.
Yes.
So the laser is something done in the office as an outpatient procedure, like literally in the doctor's office, not usually in the surgery center. The laser is usually done earlier in the course of glaucoma. In fact, it's a valid treatment from the time you're first diagnosed if you have open-angle glaucoma. And it's considered very low risk. In fact, in studies comparing laser treatment to medication, the laser is as effective on average as medication and as safe on average as medication. On the other hand, trabeculectomy is a much more involved procedure, as Dr. Fuenberg mentioned very briefly in passing. Trabeculectomy has higher risks. It's much more effective than the laser, but higher risks. And we usually reserve trabeculectomy when people have failed to respond to eye drops or laser treatment. There are exceptions to that, depending on the type of glaucoma and the patient's condition, but in general, that's the typical treatment for open-angle glaucoma.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, and thank all of you.